Welcome back, everybody, to the afternoon session. So the time of this retreat is slowly winding to a close. So our mind is probably thinking about the future at this point. And this is normal coming to the end of a retreat. What will we do tomorrow evening? What will we do the next day? And we still have this time, this whole afternoon for practice. When we do a retreat, sometimes we start to feel very good. And then that comes out. We want to talk about it with our friends. But if we hold it back, if we hold it in, it will feel even better. So we can stay with the practice for one more afternoon, and chances are we will feel quite good about it. I would like to revisit this idea of eating. The Buddha talked a lot about eating properly. This is called nutriment. So we eat and we get nutrients, we get nutriment, we get vitamin and nutriment from food. And there's different types of food. There's the coarse physical food, which feeds the rupa body, the rupa kaya. So the form, the body, the physical body. But then there's also feeling nutriment. So we always want good feeling. We want to feed on good feelings and not have bad feelings. So that's the Vedana nutriment. And then there's the Phassa, which is contact. That's also a form of nutriment. And then the most refined is there's the consciousness, the Vijnana nutriment. So the consciousness is feeding on ideas, feeding on the mental phenomenon. So everything happening to us is like we're seeking out, we're seeking food. In Thai, like, well, there's a kamput in Isan, is hagin. Hagin means like cheap, but also you could say everything is hagin as rup hagin, vedana hagin, phassa hagin, vinyan hagin. Everything is hagin. So everything is like we're in all ways we are feeding on things. And this is not bad. This is not a bad thing. We don't want to be starving. We do have to feed on the right things, but we have to learn how to feed on wholesome things and not on unwholesome things. So the story that illustrates this is there was a teaching that Ajahn Sona gave one time, and it was actually a retreat I attended with him, where he gave a metta retreat in 2014. And at that time, I was looking after Pacific Hermitage for Ajahn Sudanto, who was on a 1-year sabbatical, and I was looking after it for 3 months. There was a rotation. Ajahn Kurunadamo looked after it for 3 months. I looked after it for 3 months. Ajahn Kurunadamo looked after it for 4 months. And Ajahn Jotipalo looked after it for about 3 months, while Ajahn Sudanto took a break from being abbot of Pacific Hermitage. And at that time, when I was there was this annual retreat. Normally Ajahn Sona would help give an annual Pacific Hermitage retreat. So we went up to Birkin in British Columbia, Canada. And I actually thought I was going to have to teach it. And I was very happy when he spontaneously taught the retreat, because I didn't really know what I was going to do. And he gave a very nice metta retreat. It's a 10-day retreat with about 15 people attending. So it's a Bengan Ang, like just everybody together in the sala at Birkin. And he gave a teaching about Sujata feeding the Buddha, feeding the Bodhisattva. And that was the last meal upon which he relied in order to attain Buddhahood. So he relied upon that meal in order to fully realize enlightenment. So that's very interesting, because the Bodhisattva, he was already eating before that. He had stopped his austerities. He had stopped what we call the Dukrakirya. Dukrakirya is where he was starving himself, causing pain for himself, and to the point where he almost died. And he gave that up, and he started to go Pindabat again, and he brought himself back to more of a normal state. But then before he went to the Bodhi tree, he was offered a meal by Sujata. And this was this very nice meal of a very special form of milk rice. And he ate that very good meal, and relying upon that nutriment, then realized had the energy and the gratitude and all of these different qualities came together, where he was able to, relying upon that plus upon his spiritual qualities, his parami that he'd already developed, then he was able to realize Nibbana under the Bodhi tree. So we can think of that as, before the Bodhisattva went to practice and finish his practice, he had to eat. He had to nourish himself. And in a way, you could say he was receiving metta from the Yat Yom, receiving the metta from that meal offering, from that very special meal offering. And it was very good food. He wasn't eating something that was just like castaway scraps. She had made this very, very special meal for him. And he allowed himself to partake of that meal, which must have tasted very good. But he receiving that metta, then using that as a foundation, as a puntan to finish his practice. So the way this works is very interesting, because that was very great merit. Later, the Buddha taught about that, and he said the 2 meals that are the greatest merit for a Buddha, the 2 meals related to the Buddha that are the greatest merit, is the meal offered just before his enlightenment, and then the meal offered just before his parinibbana, just before his death. Those 2 meals are considered the most meritorious. And so this meal that Sujata had offered to the Buddha, to the Bodhisattva, was very, very special. Actually, as the story goes, she thought he was a tree spirit and wanted to have a child. She wanted to pray to have a child. And so the Bodhisattva actually like haipon, like gave a blessing. And may you and your child be well. And also upon receiving this meal. And I believe that later on she did have a child, and that child ended up ordaining and becoming a monk. So we can see that the path of, even though Longpa Cha talked about tea practice, the Toraman Kilate, we don't want to Toraman Rangkai. We don't want to Toraman ourselves in the wrong way. We do want to go against the Kilate, but also we need to eat enough. We need to look after ourselves. And the Bodhisattva, he already did that horrible practice of Toraman Rangkai, where he was completely starving and looked like he must have looked very, very bad. And he said he did not recommend that practice, even though I like to think about the Buddha doing his austerities because it's so amazing that he did that just to be able to find that it was the wrong path, that he did that for our sake out of compassion. But then he told us, please don't do that. It's not the right way. Even though it is amazing that he did it, for us to do that is not right. He said, yeah, okay, I already found the Majjhima Patipada, so now it's time for you to do that. And this is in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the Atta Kilamata Nuyogo. That's the self-mortification. And then there's also Kama Sukhalika Nuyogo, which is what we're probably more familiar with, the attachment to sensuality, the sense realm, sense desire. But he said both of those are not useful. He said the Majjhima Patipada, where everything is padi, that's the useful path. That's the path of development. That's how we will progress. And Luang Por Chah would think of it. Luang Por Chah taught about it in another way, where he said the greed, the lobha or the raga tanha was the kamasu kalika nuyogo, and the anger, the krodh or moho is the atakila matanu yogo, the self-mortification. So you could think about it that way as well, if that's useful for you. So when we eat to keep ourselves going, and we have katanyu kataweti, gratitude for the metta that went into making the food. There's another story which is very interesting where I forget which king it is. I think it's King Pasenadi. It's the cakes of King Pasenadi. There's from time to time. So there's actually, it's like every day King Pasenadi has his meal, and there's these cakes, and he eats them, and they're like, he feels so good when he eats them at the for his dessert. And then he asks, can you find what are the ingredients in these cakes? Who makes these cakes? And then he sends out his his spies. And then they go and find that there's this one poor laborer who makes these cakes in the city, very poor person. And he's the one who makes these cakes and sends them to the king. And they demand to know the ingredients so that the royal cooks can make them. And so he said, okay, so he gives them the ingredients and they go back. And then the royal cooks start making these cakes. And when King Pasenadi eats them, he says, no, this is not the same. It must not be the same ingredients. And then they go back and sure, they confirm that it is the right ingredients. The royal cooks have done it properly. So King Pasenadi said, no, not the same. It must be different. They must be doing something wrong. So then they go back and say, there must be just something different you're doing, because the king says they're not the same cakes. The royal cooks, they don't know how to make it properly. And the poor laborer says, well, they are using the right ingredients, but when I make the cakes, as I'm making the cakes, I'm thinking in my mind, may the king be well, may the king be happy, may the king be well, may the king be happy. And that made all the difference. So he was actually putting his metta into these cakes and that it makes a difference. So, that's a very real thing. You can, hair standing on end. You can do that the other way too. Like if somebody is making food, but they're really not into it, they don't want to be there, somebody's forcing them to do it. If you eat that food, you can tell if you're sensitive to it, you can tell like what went into the making of the food. So our mental state is very important when we're doing these things. And I believe that with Sujata offering that meal to the Buddha, she had a very pure, wholesome mental state when she was making that milk rice for him, that very special milk rice. Even though there was a little bit of selfishness on her part, she wanted to have a child, she wanted to offer the best thing to this tree spirit, but still she had a very, very good intention. And partly based on her intentions, the Buddha actually attained awakening because of that. So everybody, the Yat Yom looking after the monks and the monks practicing, everybody is developing together. It's not just that the monks are practicing, or everybody here is practicing together and developing together. It's one of the wonderful things about the Buddha's teaching is that the lay people and the monks both develop in wholesome qualities together. It's not that only one of them is developing in wholesome qualities. So it's worth thinking about, worth considering as we start this afternoon session about what kind of things are we feeding on, and what do we put into the offerings that we make, and the kind of nutriment that we're involved with. So we'll sit for about another 25 minutes and then we can change postures.